Hi everybody, my name is John Corbett, as a lot of people know me Corbettmaths, and this is the second of our series of videos on lesson ideas. So in the last video, I explained the concept behind this series of videos, the fact that as teachers, we're quite modest and we don't always share the ideas that work out really well in the classroom. And so what I want to do is I want to share with teachers and trainee teachers some ideas that might work really well for your classes, or even with home educators, some ideas that might work out well with your students at home or your children at home. Okay, so that's the idea behind this series of videos. In our last video, we looked at the 1089 investigation and how that works really well with students in terms of practicing their subtraction and addition. And in today's video, we're going to look at the silent lesson. So in terms of the silent lesson, I read an article, I think it was in the Maths Association or the ATM years ago, on silent lessons. And whenever I read it, I thought, well, how's that going to work? And then one day I came to the topic of negative indices, and I thought this might work out really well for negative indices. So rather than just going into the classroom and telling the class, okay, whenever you've got a negative indice or a negative power, just put 1 over the positive power, rather than just telling the class that, what I thought is I would experiment with a silent lesson. And it worked really, really well. And it worked so well for negative indices. I also used it with other classes with fractional indices. I've also used it for indices just generally in terms of to the power 3, to the power 4, to the power 5, and so on. And it just worked out really, really well. So in terms of this lesson, the silent lesson, I've sort of moved the camera back a bit today. As you can see, I'm a bit further away from the camera because with this type of lesson, it's not going to be a lesson that I do sat behind my desk. I'm going to be quite animated with this lesson. So I'm going to sort of in this video show you some of the things that I would do or be aware of whenever I'm doing the silent lesson. And then I'll talk about in terms of the benefits of the silent lesson, just how it works, okay? And in terms of this concept of the silent lesson, when I first read the title of silent lesson, I thought, this is great. This reminds me back whenever I was in school, the class come in as silent, do their textbook exercises, mark the answers themselves and go out in silence. And no, this is a silent lesson whenever the teacher is silent for a good part of the lesson, but you're still teaching and explaining things while silent, okay? Okay, so let me explain how I would sort of use this in the classroom, okay? So first of all, in terms of the silent lesson, the first thing I would do is I'd write on the board, I've lost my voice, okay? So I tell a little white lie, okay? That I write on the board. So I would have written on the board before the students come in, I've lost my voice. So the first thing in terms of the silent lesson is, I would be sort of, it's not gonna be one of those lessons where you're just sat behind your desk. You're gonna have to be quite mobile in this lesson. You're going to be quite animated. Obviously, you're going to be getting them to do things by gesturing and things like that because you've lost your voice and you've got to stick with that story. So you're over by the door, you welcome them into the classroom, sort of, and they're looking like going, oh, good morning. You're like, going like this here. They're like, why do you not reply? And then you point to the board. And then the students sort of coming in, they're looking at the board and saying, he lost his voice. And they might be like, well, I heard him talk earlier. And they're like, sir, is it true? Have you lost your voice? And you're like, nothing. So they're all coming in a bit confused. You may be gesturing your books out. I got there. And maybe a couple of them are talking and not getting their books out. So you might need to get their attention. So you're like, and then they're sort of all like a bit confused because this has never happened to them before. They've probably never walked into a classroom where a teacher is not speaking whatsoever. And they're probably thinking, why is our teacher not speaking? Why have they lost their voice? I heard them talking 2 minutes ago to the head or whatever. So they're probably thinking, what is going on? So you're gesturing, you're getting all their books out, things like that there. Okay, so this lesson, it could be on perhaps negative indices or fractional indices or laws of indices or anything really at all where you want them sort of maybe to just establish some rules and so on, but drawn on what they previously know about it. So I'm going to start off by looking at negative indices and I'll maybe then lead into fractional and just plain indices and so on, okay? So negative indices, okay? If I wanted them to figure out perhaps anything to the power of 0 except for 0 is equal to 1, or perhaps if you have got to the power of -1 is 1 over. Well, then what I'm going to be doing is, okay, they've lost your voice. They're all looking at you going, what is going on today? And you're like, and you're going to write 5 cubed equals on the board. And they're sort of looking at you. And obviously, remember, if like you need them to be quiet, you can shush. You've lost your voice. You can still shush. And then you're there, and you've written the question on the board, and then you're like, you can go like, hands up, sort of gesture, hands up, and then whenever, and you can like give out the pen, and so whenever someone sort of wants to answer the question, you go in, hand them the pen, and they come to the board, and they write on the board, 5 cubed is equal to 125, and you as a teacher, you're happy with that, so you go like, maybe get them to clap and stuff like that there. Maybe go over and tick it and do like a big smiley face. Well done, you've got that right. And then you might put something else up. So perhaps, what is 2 to the power 4? Just to see if they can remember their indices here, okay? So you might sort of, put up 2 to the power 4 and, put your hands up. So then sort of, should put the hand up, you give someone the pen, you get them up to, remember you're not speaking here, you're like, And they're coming up to the board, and they go up to the board, and maybe they write 2 to the power 4. They might write that's equal to 8. Now, obviously, they're thinking perhaps 2 times 4 is equal to 8. And then you might go, and then other people in the class go, oh no, it's 16. And they might be, why? And you're sort of taking control. You're going, oh yeah, explain. About, well, so, they've done 2 times 4 is equal to 8. But 2 to the power 4 would be 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, which is equal to 16. And then you point to the one, you're like, do you understand? And they're like, oh yeah. And then you say, with that one, you could, if you wanted to, put an unhappy face, like that there, or you could just rub it out and write that's equal to 16. Okay, so you've just verified the class. Remember, they're positive indices. That's great. And remember, we're trying to get onto negative indices or to the power of 0. So what we're going to now do is, and again, I'm not speaking here. Okay, I'm just sort of, going, okay, and you go like, okay, what is 4 to the power of 0? Now, if you're just introducing this to the class for the first time, they may have not seen this before. They might not know what 4 to the power of 0 is. So you might not find, anyone's going to put their hands up here, and you're like, no. And, you're sort of gesturing, looking for volunteers in terms of who's going to answer this question. And then you might get someone to come up, and they might go up and they might go, oh, well, that's equal to 0. And you might, you might go, and then you're sort of, and the class will wait to see if it's right or not. You're like, and then you go, right, 4 to the power of 0 equals. And then you sort of get someone else to sort of come up and, so you get another volunteer up, and they might go, well, is it equal to 4? And then again, you sort of go, and you're like, and then you're going to then sort of go, and then eventually you might go 4 to the power of 0, and someone might come up, and then you get them up, and again, remember you're not speaking here, and you get a volunteer up, and then they go 4 to the power of 0 is equal to 1, and you're like, and then you do that, and you're like, and then you sort of go, what's 8 to the power of 0? And then someone else comes up, and then for that one, because they've seen this one, they're probably then to guess that's equal to 1. And then you might go, what's 20 to the power of 0? And then what happens is, again, they're sort of spotting this, and then someone says, oh, well, it's always equal to 1. Someone had mentioned that in the class, and you're like, and you'd be like, you sort of, can you sort of, you're gesturing, and here they'll say, or, you might even say, explain to the class, and then someone will say, oh, well, it's always equal to 1. And you're like, great. You might get onto the fact later on that, 0 to the power of 0, to sort of watch out for that one. But you sort of establish that rule. And the class have established that rule by sort of having guesses, then they've spotted the pattern, they're verbalizing it, explaining it to each other because you're not speaking. And then you sort of, you've established that anything to the power of 0 except for 0 is equal to 1. And then we're going to get onto the negative powers, okay? So we might sort of go, what's 5 to the power of negative 1? And then at this point, you're going to have a wide range of guesses. You might get someone sort of guessing that's equal to, and again, you're just sort of getting them to come up. You're walking around the room, you're over, you're not just standing behind the desk where I'm here. You're sort of getting volunteers up. You're sort of, and someone might get up to the board and they're out sort of that's equal to -5, perhaps thinking they multiply it together. So you do your little dot, dot, the eyes and the nose, and you're going, and then you're looking for another volunteer. 5 to the power of -1 is equal to, and then they might sort of guess 1, they might guess 0. And what you might find with that one is they might not actually establish that. They might not actually guess it's equal to 1/5 at this point, or 0.2 at this point. So at this point, what you might do is, you're sort of going around the room and your things, back in 1 second. At this point, no one's getting there. You might just pick out a calculator and go, oh. And then they type it into the calculator, and then they get, well, I just need this unhappy face. They then might find that that's equal to 1/5. And you're like, right. And then, they come up and do that, and you're like, happy face. And then you sort of do, maybe 6 to the power of -1. And they're typing it into their calculator, and they get that's equal to 1/6. And then they might do 8 to the power of -1, and they get that's equal to 1/8. And then someone will say, oh, it's always 1/, and they establish that. And you're like, and, again, you're not speaking, you're just going. But they're establishing these rules, okay? Which is probably a bit more exciting than you just sitting in the front of the room and saying, with a negative power, just put 1 over the positive power and things like that, okay? So we've established anything to the power of 0 is equal to 1, except for 0. We've established that whenever you have got to the power of negative 1, it's 1 over the reciprocal of the number that you're doing it to. And then we could get into the negative powers, perhaps the negative 2. We could take 5 to the negative 2. And again, you're sort of looking for volunteers to come up and sort of use the pen. Again, you're not speaking. Ideally, you've got a bigger board than this to keep a lot of this on the board and stuff as well. And then, hopefully they'll, maybe guess negative 10, or they might go maybe 1 over 10 instead of 1 over 25, something like that. And again, you're getting there in terms of, 1 over 10, you're sort of building up, unlucky, obviously not speaking. And then whenever you get to 5 to the negative 2, again, you can get them to try the calculator. If they don't get there, you might find that they work it out, they have an educated guess, and they get that's equal to 1 over 25. And then 6 to the power of negative 2 is 1 over 36. And they're establishing, they're finding this, and then they might sort of go spot a pattern, and someone might go, well, it's 1 over the number squared. And then you go, Now, once you feel you've got far enough with to the power of 0, to the power of negative 1, to the power of negative 2, maybe even try to the power of negative 3, and you're doing this silently, remember they still think you've lost your voice, then you go, shh. You then talk, and you go to the class. Okay, guys, apologies, first of all. I told you a bit of a white lie today. I haven't lost my voice. But what we've done is we've done a silent lesson today, and we have explored. And the amazing thing is, see, whenever you've spent 15 minutes of the lesson not speaking, not saying anything, and they've been talking and they've been learning and doing this themselves, when you start to speak, you can almost feel the class hanging off every single word you say. It's like, he's talking. Well, I've never experienced anything like it before. 15, 20 minutes saying nothing, you're animated, you're interacting, and then you go, okay, class, we've looked at anything to the power of 0, except for 0 is equal to 1, okay? That's something that's going to be very important whenever we're looking at indices. We've also looked at the fact that whenever we have something to the power of negative 1, that's 1 over the number. So for instance, if we had 10 to the power of negative 1, is equal to 1 over 10. If we had to the power of negative 2, it's 1 over the number squared. And you can actually feel the whole class hanging off the words you're saying. It's fascinating. You should, if you try out the lesson, you'll sort of experience it. It's great. And you can sort of then establish the rules, jot down some notes if you wanted to. You could talk about the fact you're negative 3, 1 over the number cubed, and so on. You could even sort of say, like, okay, okay, that's fantastic. Okay, now what I want you to do is I want to try some questions on, some exam questions, whatever. And then what you can do is, okay, then you can get into perhaps if you had, like something like, 3/4 to the power of the negative 2. You could then sort of talk about that. You can maybe even go back to using the pen, the smiley faces and things like that. But in terms of the silent lesson, it's just amazing. Whenever you start to speak, they just sort of hang off the words you say. And it's just sort of, whenever you're not speaking, they've never experienced something like that before. I've used it for negative indices. I've used it for fractional indices. That's quite a nice one. Whenever you have, for instance, something like not in the same lesson, I would tend to do the silent lesson just once with a class. I wouldn't do it, once with negative indices and once with positive, with fractional and so on. I tend to just use this lesson once. You can maybe combine it where you do the negative and the fractional as well, and then start speaking perhaps. But if you had some, for instance, I would maybe do 4 to the power of a half to begin with, and then they'll get that's equal to 2, and you're sort of leading them down that misconception to begin with, where they think, oh, you half it, and then you put up something like 16 to the half, and then someone will get up to the up to front right 8, and then you do the unhappy face. And they're like, huh? And they're like, what's going on? Power of a half, and then someone goes, get that's equal to 4. Or if they need to use the calculator, again, you can get them to use the calculator, and then it brings them down the right path. What's great then is once you've done this, you can then also get into the reasons as to why these are the cases. So for instance, one thing you can do is, you've got them to establish the rules. One thing you can do is actually just before you go into doing the textbook exercise, you can just say, I just want to point something out to you. That if you have 5 cubed, that's equal to 5 times 5 times 5, that's equal to 125. If you have 5 squared, that's 5 times 5, which is 25. If you have 5 to the power of 1, that's equal to 5. If you go 5 to the power of 0, well, you notice here, every single time we're dividing by 5. We're dividing by 5. We're dividing by 5. We're dividing by 5. We're going to be dividing by 5. So 5 divided by 5 would be equal to 1, and so on. So then if you had 5 to the power of negative 1, it's going to be 1 divided by 5, which is 1/5, and so on, because you're dividing by 5 every single time you decrease that power by 1, you're dividing by whatever the base was, okay? And likewise, with fractional indices, you can even use your laws of indices to explain why that's the case. For instance, if you had 9 to the power of a half times 9 to the power of a half, well, that'll have to be 9 to the power of 1, so that's equal to 9. Well, it's going to have to then be 3 times 3, which is the square root of 9, and so on, okay? So you can sort of use, when you start to speak, they're going to sort of really listen intently to what you're saying, and then you can sort of explain the reasons to why those rules are the case, and that's it. But that's the silent lesson. I found it really, really useful for even basic indices. You can use it with younger year groups or lower ability classes. You can look at indices. You can use it for negative indices, fractional indices, really whatever you want to. But it's just that concept of you being silent, pretending you've lost your voice. You're gesturing to them. You're getting them up. You're doing this little smiley faces or unhappy faces. And then whenever you do decide to speak, once you've found that they've established the rules, then they're really listening intently to you. And it's just something I've found out that worked really well for me in the classroom. And it's something I've really, really enjoyed whenever I'm teaching certain topics. And that's it. And that's it. So I really, really hope you found the second episode of the Lesson Ideas series of videos useful. I hope you found it useful. If you have found it useful, please like it and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Also, if you get any comments or suggestions, feel free to comment on the video as well. And that's it. And I'll see you next week for the next video. Cheers. Bye.